On the 20th of December 2023, I uploaded a video entitled, "Is This the Worst Afrocentrist on Twitter?", in which I critiqued an Afrocentrist Twitter user called Great House, who currently has 33,300 followers as of the time of writing this script, 10th of June 2024. At the end of this video, I'll give a brief explanation of why I call him an Afrocentrist and differentiate between the academic level Afrocentrism, which is actually taken seriously by mainstream scholarship, and the populist Afrocentrism peddled by Great House, which is not taken seriously by mainstream scholarship. Great House used to post fairly mild and relevant critiques and corrections of Eurocentric history, but in 2023 he started posting increasingly inflammatory and inaccurate claims about history, aimed not at correcting misrepresentations of African history, but at distorting European history. This rewarded him with a significant growth in followers. In my previous video on Great House, I quoted 5 of his tweets as examples of why he is so consistently incompetent at representing history, demonstrating how he cites sources he hasn't validated, doesn't know how to assess sources for accuracy, doesn't understand how to read sources, doesn't know how to do proper research, and even cites sources which clearly don't support any of his statements. When the video was brought to his attention on the 8th of February 2024, Great House claimed to be totally unconcerned by it, saying, quote, "Actually, I find it hilarious and flattering," end quote. However, from the fact that he neither contested any of the claims nor acknowledged any of his errors, I concluded he was far from pleased and was simply trying to ignore it as an embarrassment exposure of his errors. This conclusion was substantiated when on the 15th of March 2024 he made 2 tweets in which he attempted to defend 2 of his previous claims and demanded an apology from me. One of his tweets read, quote, "I expect a retraction and public apology," end quote. The other read, quote, "You're going to owe me an apology for that slanderous video," end quote. Both of his tweets were accompanied by sources which he clearly believed supported his claims and discredited my arguments. In this video, I'll demonstrate that he has, yet again, shown how incompetent he is at research and validate my decision to ignore his request for a retraction and apology. Did Mansa Musa enslave anyone or trade slaves? On the 15th of March 2024, in a tweet in which he told me, quote, "I expect a retraction and public apology," end quote, Great House provided a link to a series of tweets on Mansa Musa, the 14th century emperor of Mali, whose pilgrimage to Egypt became the subject of several highly exaggerated historical accounts from the 14th to the 17th century. Although Great House believed the tweets to which he linked contradicted the arguments I made in my own video, as we will see, the very source he cited provides support for what I said. Great House also tweeted, quote, "You falsely accused me of claiming there was no slavery in Mali, even though I specifically asked for evidence that Mansa Musa personally owned and sold slaves. That's like saying there was slavery in America, therefore John Adams was a slave owner and slave trader," end quote. I responded to him, noting, quote, "I didn't say you claimed there was no slavery in Mali. I quoted you directly saying something else," end quote, and providing a screenshot of my video transcript to prove this. Great House further tweeted, quote, "Also provide evidence that Mansa Musa traded slaves and took 12,000 of them on pilgrimage," end quote. In response, I replied, quote, "You clearly haven't seen my video or you would know what I actually said. Please watch it properly and take notes accurately so you can quote it directly," end quote. If he had watched my video properly, he would have seen that I totally rejected the idea that Mansa Musa took 12,000 slaves on his pilgrimage and argued against it. He would also have seen that the video provided evidence that Musa was directly involved in the slave trade. Clearly Great House hadn't watched my video properly, so let's return to my video and see what I actually said. Firstly, I said, quote, "Great House has claimed Emperor Mansa Musa of the Mali Empire in West Africa did not own slaves," writing, quote, "I'm challenging you to provide evidence that Mansa Musa enslaved anyone or traded slaves," end quote. Note how I quoted Great House directly. In my original video, I also explained how Great House's errors were the result of his own bad research, saying, quote, "Great House provided screenshots of quotations of what he said were, quote, the only eyewitness accounts of Mansa Musa and his pilgrimage to Mecca," end quote. In the quotations, no slaves were mentioned. Consequently, Greathouse asserted Musa had not travelled with any slaves, never enslaved anyone, and never traded slaves. End quote. It's important to note the point I was making here, that Greathouse was not reading his own sources properly. He only partially quoted historical accounts speaking of Mansa Musa taking slaves on his pilgrimage because he didn't realise the book he was taking these accounts from had edited the accounts and omitted the references to slaves. The issue I was raising was Greathouse's failure to read sources correctly. Greathouse has yet to acknowledge the error he made with his sources. For example, I observed, quote, one of the sources Greathouse cited was the Arab philosopher Ibn Khaldun. Because Greathouse used a book which only quoted Khaldun partially, he didn't realise that Khaldun made explicit mention of Musa's private slaves and the slavery of his empire. I found a scholarly source quoting the part of Khaldun's report, which Greathouse's book left out. End quote. Greathouse quoted 3 sources as evidence that Mansa Musa did not bring slaves on his pilgrimage and did not own slaves at all, despite the fact that all 3 of them stated Mansa Musa did bring slaves on his pilgrimage. This is a clear case of Greathouse simply not reading his own sources correctly, and despite his efforts to correct me, he has completely failed to acknowledge the errors he made in misreading his own sources. However, it must be noted that in my own video, I myself disputed the historical accuracy of these accounts, observing that the number of slaves they claimed Mansa Musa brought on his pilgrimage was wildly exaggerated, and that even the lowest figure given was unrealistic. Specifically, I said, quote, these figures of thousands of slaves being brought on Musa's pilgrimage are clearly wildly overblown. The Tariq-es-Sudan, an Arabic language record of the history of Timbuktu in West Africa, gives a much smaller figure of 500 slaves, but the logistics of even this number are still good cause for skepticism, end quote. So when Greathouse asked me to, quote, provide evidence that Mansa Musa traded slaves and took 12,000 of them on pilgrimage, end quote, it was clear that he hadn't watched my video properly. I never said Mansa Musa took any slaves on his pilgrimage. I rejected figures such as 14,000 and 12,000 as the fantasy of exaggeration, and I said even the reference to 500 slaves was not credible. At this point, it's worth noting that the source Greathouse cited on the 15th of March 2024 in an attempt to contradict me literally supported me. Citing the figure of 500 slaves in Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, I had said, quote, the logistics of even this number are still good cause for skepticism, end quote. And the source Greathouse cited likewise said, quote, specialists such as John Hunwick rightly dismiss both estimates as grossly inflated, explaining that, quote, logistical problems of feeding and providing water during the crossing of the Sahara rule out numbers of this order, end quote. It's clear Greathouse wasn't even reading the sources he was citing in his attempt to contradict me. In his demand for a retraction and apology, Greathouse stated, quote, I specifically asked for evidence that Mansa Musa personally owned and sold slaves, end quote, despite the fact that I had already done this, citing an Oxford University Press history book, which stated, quote, Mansa Musa allowed slavery in his kingdom and owned thousands of enslaved people himself. Many of these enslaved people worked in the gold and salt mines that produced his wealth, end quote. In my video, I also said, quote, other sources tell us that, contrary to Greathouse's claim, Musa was directly involved in the slave trade and used slaves in his domestic economy, in particular for gold and salt mines on which his wealth was founded. In my video, I also pointed out that one of Greathouse's own sources, quote, stated plainly that in Mansa Musa's country, they only used slave women for transport, proving very clearly that Mansa Musa did indeed enslave people, end quote. In his demand for a retraction and apology, Greathouse objected to my reading of this source, saying, quote, that's like saying there was slavery in America, therefore John Adams was a slave owner and slave trader, end quote. But this is a false analogy. The source does not simply say there was slavery in Mali, as we could say there was slavery in America. It states that in Mali, at the time Mansa Musa was emperor, quote, they only use slave women for transport, end quote. There is no reason to read the word they in this source as meaning other people in Mali use slave women for transport, but Emperor Mansa Musa does not use slaves at all. Additionally, while John Adams was the President of the United States, there was nothing in his role as President which either required him to own slaves or would give us reason to believe he owned slaves, especially since he wrote publicly against slavery, though he was only in favour of gradual abolition. Whereas in Mansa Musa's case, since he was the emperor, he literally owned Mali's gold mines, which used slave labour. Consequently, in order to argue Mansa Musa did not own slaves, it would be necessary to argue that although he owned the mines, he didn't own the slaves, which would be like arguing that cotton plantation owners in the USA owned the cotton fields, but not the slaves. Note that Great House never provides any evidence that Mansa Musa did not own slaves and was not involved in the slave trade, and that even the source he cited in his accusatory tweet to me did not say either of these things. In my video, I also pointed out that the book Great House himself had cited said, quote, Ibn Khaldun commented on the wealth of Mansa, illustrated in the amount of gold and number of slaves he owned. Just like in any other part of the Islamic world, slavery was a part of the social norm in West Africa, end quote. In his tweets, Great House did not address this. In my video, I also cited a source published by Cambridge University Press which stated, quote, Mali, the state that dominated the region in the 13th and 14th centuries, also played a vital role in the slave, gold, and salt trades. Slaves worked in a number of occupations and had important economic and political roles, end quote. Again, these gold and salt mines were the source of Mansa Musa's wealth because he owned them. So the idea that he owned the mines but not the slaves is questionable at best. If he didn't own these slaves, who did? And why were they working in his mines? In his tweets, Great House did not address any of this either. A history text published by Routledge in 2015 similarly cites the Empire of Mali gaining wealth from, quote, gold, cotton, salt, ivory, and colta nuts, end quote, before adding, quote, the trans-Saharan slave trade was also a major source of wealth for the empire, end quote. Again, the idea that Mansa Musa was not involved in the slave trade, despite the fact that he was earning wealth from the sale of slaves, is absurd. It's also worth noting that Great House has not read properly the tweets he cited in his attempt to contradict me, which provide further support for my arguments. The author of those tweets, Isaac Samuel, argues against the claim that Mansa Musa brought thousands of slaves on his pilgrimage, or even 500 slaves. As we have seen, that is exactly what I did in my own video. But Samuel does not argue that Mansa Musa did not own any slaves, nor does he argue Mansa Musa was not involved in the slave trade. In fact, Samuel even acknowledges that during his pilgrimage, Mansa Musa acquired a number of Turkish slaves. In the website article from which his tweets were drawn, Samuel accepts an account from Arab historian Ibn Fadlallah al-Umari, who visited Egypt not long after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, and says, quote, in a very lengthy account which includes details of Musa arriving with 100 camel loads of gold and his meeting with the Mamluk Sultan, where both parties exchanged gifts, al-Umari writes that he, the Mamluk Sultan, continued to send him, Mansa Musa, Turkish slaves and other provisions throughout his stay, and that he had a quantity of provisions purchased for his, Mansa Musa's, companions and his suite, end quote. Samuel is quick to add, quote, al-Umari simply describes Musa's entourage as companions, and the only mention of slaves in the context of Musa's pilgrimage were the Turkish slaves gifted to Musa by the Egyptian Sultan, end quote. But this is still an acknowledgement that Mansa Musa was a slave owner. Consequently, even Great House's news source states plainly that Mansa Musa owned slaves, and Great House appears to be completely unaware of this. Again, it is worth noting that Samuel does not argue Mansa Musa did not own slaves, or that he was not involved in the slave trade, and he does not deny the existence of the slaves who produced the gold from Mansa Musa's mines, the source of his wealth. His article only attempts to argue that historical accounts of Mansa Musa bringing thousands of slaves on his pilgrimage to Egypt are completely exaggerated and unreliable, which, again, is the point I made in my own video. Samuel concludes, quote, while Musa's companions did acquire Turkish slaves, we can be certain, based on the available evidence, that Musa's entourage consisted almost entirely of free West African Muslims who accompanied their emperor on a journey they were very familiar with. End quote. There's more which could be written on Samuel's article, including his attempts to read various historical references to certain men and women accompanying Mansa Musa as servants rather than slaves. He cites the Arab historian Ibn Kathir, writing in 1336, about 22 years after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage, saying Mansa Musa brought 20,000 khadam, an Arabic word Samuel translates as servants. Samuel cites several sources in support of this reading, including a dictionary of Arabic, an encyclopedia of the Quran, and the book Race and Slavery in the Middle East by historian Terence Walls. It's to Samuel's credit that he lists not only the titles of the books he cites, but also the names of their authors, as well as specific page numbers, though he doesn't cite publication dates. This looks very convincing. However, I was sufficiently interested in the subject to actually locate and read these sources he cited, and when I did, well, that's a subject for another video, but for now I'll just say that once you scratch the sources of these books, you find Samuel's argument is a lot less convincing. It's a great example of why you shouldn't simply accept sources on face value, including the sources I cite in my own videos, and why investigating the sources cited in anyone's video is a good idea if you really want to be certain of the facts. What was the early modern witch hunt death toll? On the 15th of March 2024, in a tweet in which he told me, quote, "You're going to owe me an apology for that slanderous video," end quote, Great House provided a link to a PDF on the witch hunt trials. Reading through it, I saw nothing which disproved any of the arguments I had made in my video, so I replied, quote, "Let me know when you have any evidence that I've made any slanderous statements and make specific claims with specific evidence," end quote. In return, Great House responded, quote, "You claimed a total of 60,000 witches were killed. Evidence says it's 200,000 to 500,000, end quote. He was pulling these figures from the article to which he had linked, which asserted, quote, "From the early decades of the 14th century until 1650, continental Europeans executed between 200,000 and 500,000 witches, 85% or more of who were women," end quote. What we find is that this is a typical case of Great House making claims which he never substantiates with evidence, and a typical case of him failing to even quote the people he is talking about. In my video, I didn't say a total of 60,000 witches were killed. What I actually did was cite another Twitter user who had replied to Great House's original tweet, telling Great House that the scholarly consensus for the highest estimate of the witch hunt death toll is around 60,000. This user wrote, quote, "The amount of witches burnt in Europe from the 14th to the 18th century is estimated to be around 30,000 to 60,000 in total," end quote. In my video, I didn't actually provide a firm figure for the witch hunt death toll, mainly because the scholarly consensus has settled on a range, not a specific number. But the key point here is that Great House completely misrepresented what I said and attributed to me a statement I had never made. Now let's turn to his source, a scholarly journal article by sociologist Nachman Yehuda, who says, quote, "During the whole period between 200,000, the most conservative estimate, and 500,000 people were executed, burned, drowned, beheaded, strangled, or hanged on accusations of witchcraft," end quote. However, instead of citing historical evidence, Ben Yehuda cites the estimates of three previous scholars, George Lyman Kittredge, whose work was published in 1929, Russell Hope Robbins, whose work was published in 1959, and Elliot P. Curry, whose work was published in 1968. Just so we're clear on this, Great House is relying on an article published in 1980 by an author who cited no original research into the witch hunt death tolls, nor cited any historical evidence for the death toll range he cited, and only cited the estimates of three previous scholars, the most recent of which was published in 1968, and the oldest of which was published in 1929. This is very bad research. It's bad enough that Great House is quoting a scholar who wrote on this subject over 40 years ago, which is way out of date for this subject, but it's even worse that the scholar he is quoting was relying on the estimates of only three scholars, all of which who were already out of date in 1980. 9 years earlier, in 1971, historian Frank Donovan wrote, quote, "Several modern writers claim that 9 million people met their deaths during the witchcraft persecution, but offer no statistical records to support this estimate." On the other end of the scale is the educated guess of R.H. Robbins and others that the total may have been about 200,000, end quote. This is at least some support for Ben Yehuda's estimate of 200,000, but notice this was published in 1971, over 50 years ago now. But there is clear evidence that this figure was already out of date just a few years later. In 1977, historian E. William Monter wrote, quote, the likeliest guess is that the total number of trials exceeded 100,000 and the number of executions was somewhere below that figure, end quote. So even by 1977, some scholars were arguing for a figure below 100,000. In 1987, after presenting 2 pages of actual historical data and explaining its origin, Brian Levac wrote, quote, it would not be unreasonable to conclude, therefore, that European communities executed about 60,000 witches during the early modern period. A total of approximately 110,000 witchcraft prosecutions and 60,000 executions may be significantly lower than many previous estimates, but these figures still represent a grim reality, especially if we keep in mind that most witches were tried either for crimes they did not commit or for crimes that were greatly exaggerated, end quote. I've made a previous video on the early modern witch hunt death toll and how historical estimates of millions were the product of misinformation, lack of rigorous statistical analysis, and speculation. During the late 20th century, historians gradually discovered that while around 100,000 people were prosecuted, far fewer were ever actually killed. There is actually hard historical evidence for only around 12,000 people put to death, and even accounting very generously for missing, incomplete, or otherwise unavailable records, scholars agree that the total death toll is unlikely to be higher than 50 to 60,000. In 2016, historian Julian Goodacre wrote, quote, in the last 30 years or so, the most common estimates have come down from about 100,000 to about 40,000, before rising again to a current consensus of about 50,000 executions, end quote. 30 years earlier than 2016 is 1986, and we've already seen clear evidence that high scholarly estimates were well below 200,000 even by the end of the 1970s. Earlier, in 2013, historian Brian Levac, a specialist in the early modern witch hunts, wrote, quote, this research has resulted in a broad agreement that approximately 100,000 individuals in Europe and colonial America were prosecuted for witchcraft between 1400 and 1775, and that the number of executions did not greatly exceed 50,000, end quote. Even earlier, in 2003, historian William Burns wrote, quote, the consensus estimate of most modern academic scholars of the early modern witch hunt is that there were about 100,000 persons tried and that 40,000 to 60,000 accused witches died in the course of the witch hunt, about 80% of whom were women, end quote. So there is absolutely no reason to cite outdated scholarship from 1980 on this subject. There has been a solid scholarly consensus for around 30 years, which is nowhere near 200,000, let alone 500,000. Once again, we find Greathouse has been completely misled by his incompetent research methods. Let's not forget what this was all about to start with. Greathouse originally claimed, quote, 17th century German witch hunter Benedict Karpsov sentenced 20,000 women to burn at the stake for witchcraft, end quote. I already proved this was false in my previous video, commenting, quote, a section in the Encyclopedia of Witchcraft, the Western Tradition, 2006, said Karpsov has falsely been blamed for sentencing 20,000 persons to death for witchcraft, identifying the myth as the accusation of a rival in 1675, end quote. I also explained that all the way back in 1959, Swedish-American sociologist Johan Thorsten Selin explained in his article Two Myths in the History of Capital Punishment that the myth about Karpsov had already been debunked and that scholar Ernest Boehm had, quote, established the fact that Karpsov probably did not impose more than 300 death sentences, end quote, adding, quote, Helmuth von Weber states that, quote, no death sentence imposed by Karpsov himself on a witch is known, and it is improbable that he ever imposed one, end quote. It is noteworthy that despite his attempt to defend an outdated witch hunt death toll which is wildly higher than the mainstream scholarly consensus, Greathouse completely avoided addressing the fact that I had proved his original claim false. Academic versus populist Afrocentrism. I referred to Greathouse as an Afrocentrist, but what do I mean by that? Now we need to look at the topic of Afrocentrism. This is a term and concept with a very complex history and a much contested meaning. According to a 2016 paper by Dr. Midas Charwani, senior lecturer at the Johannesburg Department of Historical Studies, quote, the origin of the Afrocentric philosophy cannot be established with certainty, end quote, though he credits Jamaican black activist and Pan-African Marcus Garvey as, quote, one of the most influential propagators of this ideology, end quote. Chawani observes, quote, Afrocentricity as an idea and a philosophy gained momentum during the civil rights movement in the United States of America, end quote, crediting scholars at the Temple University in Philadelphia with the institutional development of Afrocentrism and dating the term Afrocentricity to the 1970s. However, Professor Ama Mazama, Department Chair of Africology and African American Studies at Temple University, writes, quote, there is still, however, considerable misunderstanding in the academic world and, as a result, in the community at large, about what exactly Afrocentricity entails. The definitions of Afrocentricity are multiple, with most scholars giving their own working and free version of the original one elaborated by Asante, often choosing to emphasize particular aspects of the paradigm to suit their own purposes, end quote. In contrast, she writes, quote, others seem to take for granted that the term Afrocentric is self-explanatory and, as a result, do not bother to define Afrocentricity, end quote. Adding, quote, another case in point is Janice Hamlet's 1998 recently edited Afrocentric Visions, which, quite curiously, does not even contain an introduction, let alone a definition of Afrocentricity by the editor, end quote. Similarly, a 2024 review of the use of Afrocentrism as a term concluded, quote, the prior conceptual literature suggests that Afrocentrism is a heterogeneous concept with a multitude of domains associated with its measurement, end quote. Academic Afrocentrism is probably most closely associated with Professor Molefi-Kete Asante of Temple University, widely known as one of the foundational figures of the modern movement as an academic discipline. However, Chawani cites a number of other notable Afrocentrist scholars, mostly from Temple University, including Cheikh Anta Diop, Martin Bernal, John Henrik Clarke, Chancellor Williams, C. Tselon Keto, Mariamu Welsh Asante, Abu Abari, Ama Mazama, Theophile Obenga, and Terry Kershaw. If you're hoping for a critique of Afrocentrism, I'm sorry you won't find it here. That's not the purpose of this video, and I don't see the need to critique the academic discipline of Afrocentrism any more than any other academic discipline. There are disciplines with far more potential for social harm which require far more critique. As with other ethnocentric histories, there is certainly place for the criticism of Afrocentric history, especially as it has emerged in the United States, and that's something I may make a video on in the future. Meanwhile, if that's something you're interested in, I invite you to read the 2015 paper, Africa and Afrocentric Historicism, a critique, by Professor Tunde Adeleke of the Iowa State University Department of History. If you look at the list of references linked in the video description, you'll find a hyperlink to a publicly available copy of the paper. However, when I use the term Afrocentrist to describe Great House, I am using the popular definition of Afrocentrism, since Great House is not a scholar of African studies or producing academic level work. Professor Manning Marable of African American Studies at Columbia University explained this popular definition in her introduction to the 2001 scholarly work, Dispatches from the Ebony Tower, Intellectuals Confront the African American Experience. Firstly, Marable observed, quote, but frequently even the proponents of Afrocentricity argued about the definition and meaning of the concept, end quote. He then explained, quote, in everyday language, Afrocentrism has come to mean a positive black consciousness that is anchored in the knowledge of African culture and history, end quote. It should be noted that, although this is a popular level definition, not an academic one, it is nevertheless a positive definition. Note the key part of the definition, quote, a positive black consciousness that is anchored in the knowledge of African culture and history, end quote. It is not an insult or slur, nor am I using it as such. I have no doubt that Great House has a very positive black consciousness and aims to present as positive a view of black history, as he understands it, as possible. And if that was all he was doing, I wouldn't have an issue, even if he exaggerated the history to some extent. But he's not even doing that. He's not even being a good popular level Afrocentrist, since so much of his tweets these days are either grossly distorted or even entirely fabricated claims about European history in an attempt to gain clicks and social media clout through outrage bait. Consequently, he is producing what I refer to as populist Afrocentric material, which doesn't even match the popular definition of Afrocentrism. As with populist European history, which is typically barely disguised racism, populist Afrocentrism is designed simply to appeal to the lowest common denominator and the widest possible audience, regardless of the facts, typically by leveraging clickbait and attempting to generate outrage. This is not history, this is not real Afrocentrism, and it just gives bad faith actors a tool with which they can attempt to discredit academic Afrocentrism. Conclusion. Today, 10th of June 2024, I noticed Great House's Twitter account is not quite as successful as it used to be. According to social media metric analyzer Social Blade, his account gained 1,986 followers in February this year, but since then has been gaining far fewer, declining sharply to only 147 gained in April and plunging to an actual loss of 47 followers in May. Although his Twitter following has seen some sharp rises and falls in the past, it does seem that this year the overall trend is continuing downwards. With just a little honest effort into proper research, Great House could use his 33,000 follower account to promote high-quality Afrocentrist content, which would be of genuine benefit to his subscribers and might even reverse his current decline. I shall follow his future social media career with some interest, and may critique some of his more outrageous errors in the future, if only to demonstrate the importance of fact-checking and how to do proper research.